We're looking at formal report writing today and also in my next session in a fortnight's time. Now, as I remember, I'm not around next week, so Wayne will be running this session as well as his Thursday lecture, and he will also be involved in all of the workshops next Tuesday. And what I'm going to do then is I will do the Monday and the Thursday lecture sessions in a fortnight time when I get back from a conference I'm going to overseas, where I'm chairing or co-chairing one of the conferences and also sitting in and going to a whole lot of presentations on big data analytics, which I'll be talking to you all about in subjects for computer science towards the end of November. So we're going to split the formal report writing sessions into two chunks, one today and then in a fortnight's time. And first of all, I want to go back to the things we were talking about last. Yeah, IT is not terribly reliable wherever you go. Are you all having troubles getting into those pages? Because I know that I've had a lot of page resets today while getting into Blackboard. So it's one of those things, guys, we deal with our unreliable IT. Now, going back to last week, we were looking at being an effective learner. Now, I trust that many of you did actually think about some of those questions I posed during the lecture, because they are valuable. So very briefly, objectives. How many thought about your objectives in terms of your attitude and your approach and your need and your reason for learning here for the next 3 or 4 years? Any progress, anything else you'd like to share with us about things you learnt about yourself and about your objectives? I shan't embarrass you by asking a show of hands of who did think about it in the last week and who didn't. But I'd like you, really, really importantly, to think about these things and to what impact these ideas you've had will have on the way that you become a good student. Part of which, of course, is to be able to work on these questions outside of the lecture, outside of the workshop, in those 10 hours or so that you've got to actually work on the module. Any further thoughts about motivation? What motivates you? Is it extrinsic factors, those things from outside, or is it your internal, intrinsic motivations that are really most important to you? Is it money, or is it fun? The fun of learning. Any additional thoughts compared with last week, or did that all cover it? We didn't spend much time thinking about the learning styles, the when and the where and the how. Did any of you think about that during the last week? Okay, not a lot of activity apparently. Let's hope there's more another time. So we'll look at the one on report structure today, and I'd like you to work on some of the other. Maybe it'll work. Oh, it is. Good. That's a repeat. Now, we spent some time in the workshop thinking about reporting structures, or how to build a structure for your reports. And I gave you that example that many of you found quite interesting, and I trust that you've actually begun to build that into what you're going to show me in the workshops tomorrow. So that's the objective. What are the academic requirements, and how does it affect the way that you look at structuring an answer? And one of the things that I want you to do before tomorrow is actually to go do a little bit of research today and overnight. Find some good sources about writing an assignment. And of course you can start off on the skills page in the electronic resources. You remember how to find it? That's where you found the Harvard referencing standards. Quite close to that are one or two tiles where you can find lots of useful information about writing academically and structuring reports. But find many more. They're useful to you. Structure. In other words, what's the recommendation? Sort of thing that we talked about last week. But then what's more important for you is to find out the reasons why we use that sort of approach to build a structure before we start writing. We're looking in the article at a fairly rigid structure in terms of introduction, context, before, after, and then consequences, and then subsections and sub-subsections as appropriate. But sometimes you might want to choose a different structure, a different way of presenting information. Maybe an essay without any headings and subheadings. And then the fourth part is, are there any consequences that come as a result of choosing different ways of structuring your report? And there's a very, very good book by Cornford and Smithson in chapter 9, which talks about writing a project report. Now, Cornford and Smithson is actually one of the very good textbooks that you'll be looking at in your third academic year when you do your dissertation project. It shows you how to lay out the standard dissertation project report. But it has some very useful things to say about general structuring of reports that you might need. At a very, very high level, most of your assignments between now and the time you graduate are going to be that typical sort of structure. In your article for this assignment, for this module, you probably won't need to have a section acknowledgements. That's where you say, I've got these ideas from here, thanks ever so much, and I've re-researched them and built them into everything, into the writing. Tables of contents, tables of figures, tables of tables can be very useful in many types of report, but not in this article because there isn't really space. A glossary is kind of useful when you want to actually translate some of those three-letter acronyms which IT is so full of. Typically, a title, your name, the module title and module code for CC 509 for this one, Introduction to Computer Science, and then perhaps the year 2014, 2015, depending on exactly what you are doing. Not in the article. The abstract is very, very important. It's a summary of what your article, your report is about. Not how to do it. It is not an introduction, but it says, these are the ideas that we analysed, these are the results, these are the conclusions. There are no references, no citations, no nothing. It's designed to capture the interest of your reader. Persuade them that it's really worth their while reading your 3 pages of your article. It is not another introduction. It's a total summary. somewhere around about 10% of the overall word count typically. But it's very much a marketing one. The table of contents, when you use them, again, is very, very valuable because as we saw last Tuesday, that substructure which we came up with, the before, the after, with subset headings, helps the reader to understand exactly what you're writing about. It helps them understand the logic, the sequence, and ideally even the conclusions at the end, because you might have little subheadings in the conclusion section in many of your reports. If you use the headers, heading 1, 2 and 3 styles to format those headings, subheadings and sub-subheadings, then Word understands what you're doing and you can create that table of contents with 1 or 2 clicks. If you use select, bold, 15 point for the headings 1 and then select, bold, 13 point, underline for heading 2 or second level and so on, Word has no clue what you're doing, and then you will have to print it all out, discover you've forgotten to leave a blank page in which to insert your table of contents, reprint it after you've done that, and then handcraft the table of contents. That can take you several trees of wood and paper, and it can take you hours to do the job. And as soon as you insert a little bit of extra text and the paging all changes, you've got to re-edit it. If you use those styles, headers 1, 2 and 3, insert table of contents, right-click, update, whole table of contents is done just like that. As you keep writing, you can keep the table of contents up to date. You can find out what's going on, as well as the reader when you've finished. Use those insert tables of figures, and it makes life very, very easy. And you can see here from one of the versions of Word exactly how to do it. 2013, slightly differently, but not that different. Very simple to insert captions and so on. That's how you insert indexing tables or insert cross-references, and you select as you need to. Broadly, all of your tables of content, your body of report for any sort of report will follow that broad structure. Research methodology comes into your formal project reports, when you're doing some of your critical evaluations of some of the work you're doing, when you're asked to critically evaluate, for example, a choice of programming style or approach, you could use this sort of method. We broadly insist on Harvard for most of your modules. On occasion, you might be asked to use a different one, if it happens to be the standard for your chosen profession. So those of you who are doing forensics, you may find that 1 or 2 of your modules will require you to use the forensic standard of numeric referencing. But other than those, you will use Harvard referencing for your whole of your academic career here. We want, in Harvard, and in the other forms of referencing, we want a single consolidated list of references unless you are told otherwise. In the assignment for this module, this semester, you are asked to provide one list of references for all of your main written sources, and if you've got any inserted pictures, images, then use a separate list of references just for those images. But that's an exception for this semester, for this module, and is not normally the case. Harvard references are always sorted in ascending sequence of surnames of the authors. And again, under normal circumstances in Harvard, you do not number your bibliographic entries. They just list surname by surname by surname, and then in year order ascending. And it's incredibly easy to do the sorting of your bibliography, your references. You select all of the references and then do the sorting. And this is an old version, I'm afraid, but there's a little standard A to Z down arrow on the toolbar, or in the that you can use for sorting, and it looks like that. Sort text. It comes up with a little text box like that, and you don't change anything. You just click on OK, and they all magically turn into alphabetical sequence. So there's the list unsorted. There is the list 1 second later, all sorted. So you don't have to click and drag or move the stuff. It's very, very easy. As long as you're writing your references exactly like that, in each full reference in one paragraph, so the name, the year, the titles, and the URLs, all in one paragraph. And then you can sort it very, very easily. And then you might, in many reports, many of your assignments, you may need to have some appendices for information which is interesting, but not directly relevant, although you might refer to them as a source of information. Overall, academic. These are really, really important. You need to understand your audience. Who is reading it? What is their knowledge of the subject? What is their understanding of the whole thing? How are you communicating to them? In a couple of weeks' time, we'll be looking at some of the fundamentals of communication. Every assignment, every report always has a beginning, a middle, and then the end. Now, it sounds obvious, but often you'll find people introducing stuff brand new out of a clear blue sky, parachuting down into the conclusion. Never been discussed, it's just suddenly another thought they had. Oh, I'll put in the conclusion. No, it integrates back into that beginning, middle, and ending approach. And you are not trying to show how brilliant you are. You're actually trying to inform your reader. You're trying to be really helpful. And in terms of quotations, yes, you can put quotations in and put, as long as you put the citation to where it comes from. But essentially, very few quotations are worth wasting word count on. Because you have to then interpret and explain why that quotation is of relevance, what it means in the context, which is anyway going to be at least as long as your quotation, if not longer. And if you've already got 50 words of quotation, well, that's 50 words less you've got to meet, to explain what is really important and what it's really about. So ideally, do not use quotations. And in any case, in an academic sense, we, as academics marking your work, we are essentially blind to quotations because they don't add anything. They don't help us to understand how you're thinking. They just tell us that you're good at searching and finding material. But that's what you're writing about. You're analysing that material that you've actually found, not just quoting it. Because we want to find out how you analyse and think about all of those things that you've researched and found. Do not ask your reader to think. In other words, don't put a table or a graph there and say, oh, by the way, just have a look at graph 3 and then carry on. You are the one who is doing the thinking. So write down what the consequences or the impact or the meaning of that graph, that picture, or that table of numbers is. Don't expect the reader to have to think. Because what's going to happen is the reader is going to think different things to what you thought about it. And they will probably come up with a different meaning and a different message from what you thought, and that will then derail their thinking processes from what you are trying to convey. So explain it. Write it down. Yes, refer to figure 1 or figure 2 or table 3. But explain why figure 1 or table 3 is important and what it's actually contributing in terms of developing your argument. Don't get me or any of the readers to think. So when you're writing about these changes over the last 30 years and the consequences of those changes, remember, you need to tell your readers, your family and friends, why that picture is actually important. So if you are doing games and you're looking at the difference between the 1980s games with sprites and 2014 games with incredibly complex graphics, yes, you might well have two little pictures in there, take figure 1 and figure 2, but tell them, A, that that's a 1980s sprite base, and this is a 2014 high-grade graphics game, and draw out for them what it means to them playing games compared with the sprites, which kind of are pretty basic little pictures that move around slowly, compared to modern high-grade 3D graphics and so on. What's the importance? Does it make it more interesting to play? Does it give a better representation? Or whatever? Filter out all of the irrelevant material. Remember what I showed you last week, that for that pre and post or then and now teaching style, there were 10 or 15 different things which were changed, but I was only choosing 3 before, 3 after, not all 10 or 12. Just choose the things that make the story flow from the beginning to the end, in the word count or the page count that you've actually got. Look back to the last week or so where we had a look at some of those facts. Some trivia, apparently. However, they're not. Please use the spell checker in Word or your word processing document. Use the grammar checker. So go into options and make sure that the spell checker is on and that the grammar checker is on. And watch the little wavy blue lines, little wavy red lines, the little wavy green lines. And with the spell checker, remember that it will only tell you that the word is correctly spelt. Sometimes it will put a little wavy blue line to suggest that maybe that word, although correctly spelt in English, is not the right word. And I had an example this morning where I was thought I'd typed the word could do something, and I'd actually missed out the U, so it said cold. So I suddenly saw a little blue line under the cold where it was really telling me, I don't believe you. Cold is not the right word there. So I then had to, but it's correctly spelt. And so I had to think, and then, yes. And think about the word fair in English. F-A-R-E, F-A-I-R, and there F-A-Y-R-E, all of which is correctly spelt, but mean different things, have a different context. And one of the things that really irritates every reader is the ability of many people, students included, to switch T-H-E-I-R, which is for possession, their books, with T-H-E-R-E there, as in place over there. And there are some students in previous years who are extremely accurate in switching T-H-E-I-R and T-H-E-R-E. However many times that it's pointed out to them, and they say, yeah, great, I'll do it for next review, they come back and it's still T-H-E-I-R for place, which is wrong, and T-H-E-R-E for ownership, wrong. So use the spell checker always, but intelligently. as you write, keep revising the work that you're doing. One sort of good idea I've found in the past is, you set aside a couple of hours to write the next section of an assignment. It's actually worthwhile taking the first 10 or 15 minutes to read through where you have finished last time and just proofread it, rethink it, check whether the sequence is right, whether this bit of text, this paragraph should be here or up there or down there. Do a little bit of proofing and editing before you get started with the main hour and a half, hour and 3/4 worth of power typing and developing and extending your assignment. Proofreading, looking for those little wiggly lines, blue, red and green, looking at, do I actually mean that? Try and step back from what you have written, and you know what you thought you'd written, and try and step back so you can actually read the words that you've written rather than the words you thought you read. And so it's always valuable to get someone else to to have a check over it with you as well, so that they pick up, oh, silly, you got that word there which you didn't really mean. It's a perfectly valid word syntactically, it's spelt correctly, but it's not actually the right word. It conveys the wrong impression. Very, very important to do those sorts of things. Now, in terms of each section or each chapter, or the whole thing, there's always going to be a little introduction to each chapter or each section, then the main part of the section, and then a little conclusion that wraps it up. And each conclusion will tend to lead on to the introduction for the next section. It's just how writing actually works. Often, particularly in the bigger, more formal reports you do and assignments, where you just got a big, say, 2,500, 3,000 word, 5-6 pages in the LNCS structure, you actually will have 2 or 3 chapters, and then it becomes really, really important to make that connection between each chapter through the conclusions of the preceding chapter and the introduction to this current chapter. And you're trying in the introduction to develop the structure that you're going to be using, and then identify that logical progression of ideas, so the reader actually understands where you're about to go. And then, in the body, you take them there. And then in the conclusion, you just briefly remind them what you've actually put into that body of the chapter or section. The final bit is that conclusion section. Applicable in your assignment for this module and for every other report you're ever going to write, whether here or out for business. That section, around about 10% of the word count often, is a summary of the key points that you want the audience or the reader to remember, key arguments, and also the results of that argument. But you must never, ever introduce new ideas. They must all have been discussed and evaluated and justified in the body of the article and the body of the assignment of the report. Never, ever introduce new ideas which haven't been analysed. And you don't need to put any formal external references in the conclusion. So they don't have any references or any citations to your bibliography or list of references. As a sort of matter of good practice, however, you might want to think about temporarily as you are writing, but then you can delete them before you publish. You can put internal references for each of your conclusions, each of your ideas, sort of brackets, see section 3.2.1, or by title if you're not numbering things. And that will then help you to be certain you're not bringing new material in that hasn't been justified, evaluated in the body of your report. And you can just, as I say, delete them just before you press the button to publish it and then submit it. Good practice to do that, but no formal external references and citations in the conclusion. Numbered lists or bullet lists, try not to use those very much. If you do have a set of lists, try to bullet items, numbered lists, bullets, whatever. Put them into a figure or a table in a sort of outline and a table reference, table caption. It just makes it neater and easier in general terms for readers to cope with lists of ideas. But then you need to expand upon that later on. You need to explain what this list is about, this list of topics, little list of items, and say why it's important and what you can develop in terms of your argument, in terms of what's interesting. You have to write that in ordinary words anyway. So having it as a table or as a figure kind of makes you aware it's there to provide simple structure that then you unpack and expand upon in the words. And then the same, got some ideas here. The same goes for charts, graphs and pictures, some of which you may well be wanting to use in your article. Again, always caption them, figure 1, figure 2, table 1, table 2, and so on. Remember, you are doing the thinking, not me. I'm critically evaluating when I mark the way that you brought the ideas together, the way that you have done some excellent research. But I'm actually looking at how you pull that all together to come up with a great article. I'm not wanting to have to think about why is that table there, what's the purpose of that picture, what's the purpose of that table of numbers or that graph. You are telling me why you think that is an important item. Just another example, but what I've highlighted is the meaning of that particular chart. It shows something important about the distribution of grades for a particular task. That there were two populations basically. Those who really got the message and got their grade A's, and then a group of 10 people who really obviously didn't get the thing at all and hadn't done it right. So it's bimodal. And it means that those people who got D's and FMs need to develop their understanding and their technique. They need to, in this particular case, follow instructions carefully and accurately, which is going to be rather important to you as you actually use the template, which I've now placed up on Blackboard in the assessment folder. You will have to download the template, the LNCS template itself. You will have to download the instructions PDF and follow it exactly in terms of how you bring the template into your PC and then activate it. Follow the instructions very, very carefully. There's also an item up there which is called ICS Template 2014, which will show you the way to actually structure it. But unfortunately, it turns out that unless you have downloaded and installed your LNCS template itself correctly, the add-ins button doesn't work properly. So you have to do the job exactly, and you'll see that up on the assessments. We'll go through that tomorrow, briefly. So that was what I wanted to talk about, formal writing. So I haven't got a watch on at the moment, so it is now nearly time. Any questions about that, folks? About structuring and about the formality of writing an assignment, the formality of structuring a report, the formality to do with tables and of lists, use of figures, and so on. Any questions, folks, before we do the zapping of your cards?